Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Flights cancelled by the thousand, queues of stranded tourists at airports and lines of cars snaking back miles from British ports. Yes, it's the peak of the summer holiday season, and Europe finds itself in the midst of travel crises. So what's behind this widespread disruption of European air travel? And is gridlock on the British coast simply the effect of Brexit, or is something much bigger going on here? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. In post-lockdown Europe, tourism is back. But airports and airlines are finding it difficult to recruit enough staff to make the process of going on holiday a smooth one. Strikes by pilots, cabin crew, and security staff are compounding the problems. Long airport queues are now commonplace. While there have been issues in North America, the scale of the problem is much bigger in Europe. Since May, thousands of flights across the continent have simply been cancelled, with major hubs such as Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam and Heathrow in London simply telling airlines they cannot handle the traffic. Should they have seen this coming? Well, we have in our studio, not at this moment, globe-trotting, Tom Jenkins, Chief Exec of the European Tourism Association. We head to Rome, in fact, just down the river from Rome in Porto di Roma. Simon Cord, a travel journalist, and in Andalusia, southern Spain, Alex Macheras, aviation analyst, who's going to try and decipher some of the gobbledygook that we've heard from airlines and airports in the course of this programme. Simon, always, whenever we talk to you, you're somewhere rather exotic. There you are down on the coast of Italy. Any trouble getting there?
Not for me, but if you look at the kinds of problems which have been afflicting travellers, particularly from the UK, the main issue is that we were having lots of very late notice cancellations, but that's now changed. We are now getting all kinds of pre-planned cancellations for British Airways and EasyJet alone. 40,000 flight cancellations this summer. That translates to taking about 7 million seats out of the market. And certainly my flight from London Heathrow to Rome, not a spare seat on it, and that goes for pretty much every other departure to and from the UK's main airports, London Heathrow and London Gatwick.
So there you are talking about EasyJet, you're talking about British Airways, yet another budget airline has cancelled far, far fewer flights. That is Ryanair. That's according to the little research that I've done. How come one airline doesn't seem to be affected, but others are? Is that incompetence or what?
No, I think there's all sorts of factors at work. One of them is actually purely about slots. The most valuable slots at any airport in the world are at London Heathrow. British Airways will do anything to hang on to its majority of the slots there. Therefore, they promised a whole number of flights this summer, which clearly, after COVID, it's clear that they couldn't run. I flew out, well, not on British Airways. My ticket said British Airways. I actually flew on Iberia of Spain. But even with bringing in help from Spain, from Finland, they don't have enough aircraft. Similar problem for EasyJet at Gatwick, promising a vast amount of flying, which they can't do. Ryanair, though, has always also expanded. It's not at the key hub airports, but crucially, they kept their aircraft going. Their pilots, their cabin crew current. In other words, they were able to kind of resume full-scale flying at a moment's notice. And everything they've done seems to be working. But we're not through the summer yet.
OK, so we leave you for the time being on the Italian Riviera, and we join Alex in southern Spain, where if the background's anything to go by, it's extremely foggy. I'm only joking. What we've just heard described by Simon, if a company is holding on to slots just so it doesn't lose them and is promising that it will fly people and then knows full well that it won't be able to, that sounds immoral.
Yeah, well, I mean, we, as Simon said, we have a whole different array of contributors that have contributed ultimately to the disruption that we're facing. Aside is the fact that many airlines, even those that were not so focused on keeping hold of slots or don't have that issue because they do not operate in Heathrow, for example, they were being very ambitious with the summer 2022 schedule that they were selling. And we had the likes of EasyJet in the first half of 2022 this year, kind of between January and April, confidently announcing that they will be ultimately operating at almost pre-pandemic levels from based on 2019 from this summer onwards. Now, of course, it's ambitious to operate anything at pre-pandemic levels when their staffing level is anything but what it was pre-pandemic. And that's the situation the industry finds itself in now. It is tremendously short of staff across the sector, across the entire aviation ecosystem, and that is having a disruptive, ultimately, impact on air travel, not just in the UK, across Europe and in so many markets globally.
Tom, bring you in. You're in the studio with me here. Willie Walsh, head of the International Air Transport Association, chief exec of IAG, which owns British Airways. Going back to what Simon was saying about desperate to keep hold of your slots, he's blaming the airport. He says, I'm surprised Heathrow has not been able to get their act together better than this. Airlines have been predicting stronger traffic than Heathrow has been predicting. They clearly got it completely wrong. To tell airlines to stop selling, what a ridiculous thing for an airport to say to an airline. Who's telling the truth here?
I don't know. I wouldn't. Truth is a fairly elusive commodity in this environment. I think the fact is that every airport, and indeed a lot of airlines, have had great difficulties gearing themselves back up to normal. I think it is, and I share with my colleagues' reaction, that it is very surprising that they declared and allotted full capacity for this summer, but didn't match that with hiring staff. And a lot of what happens...
They were hedging their bets, weren't they? Because it was cheaper for them not to hire the extra staff because they didn't know for sure than it was to perhaps have to give refunds for people who couldn't make their flights.
That might well be the case. I think what's interesting is that the fact is that this is a global problem. It's not just British Airways. It's not just Heathrow. We've had massive problems in North America. There are huge problems in Australia. There are problems in India. Everybody's having this difficulty.
And is that because they've all done exactly the same thing? They've laid off people because of the pandemic. They haven't been able to hire people back because either they've gone off to do other jobs, they've decided they don't want to work in the sector, or they just can't find the people that they've sacked. Is that a common theme throughout the industry?
It's a common theme throughout the service economy. You've got people who've been laid off from vast swathes of hotels, restaurants, attractions, and all the service industry that supports these things. They're finding it very, very difficult to source staff. Now, it's peculiarly tough in an airport where you are going to go out and hire people. The skills they have are there. They need some training. But fundamentally, your big problem is you can hire people reasonably quickly. What you can't do is get security clearance for them. It's a really sticky process staffing up in these areas.
I'm going to ask you, as the head of the European Tourism Association, in just a moment about resorts and whether they're suffering because of the incompetence of either the airlines or the airports. Hold on to that thought, if you wouldn't mind, for just a moment. Simon, I want to come back to you, not just about air travel, but also the mess we've seen at British ports, well, at Dover in particular, and at the Eurotunnel Folkestone depot, and ask you whether this is a result of Brexit. Are the French having to do many, many more checks on British travellers going across the Channel, and is that why it's taking so long?
Well, bluntly, yes. If you can imagine, for example, the frontiers that Turkey or Russia has with the European Union, they are very big, very hard border crossings. And the UK, after the Brexit decision, decided we wanted that, but we were actually going to have that in British territory. And so if anybody knows that particular part of the county of Kent, it's very beautiful, but it's got very little space for expansion. And all of the infrastructure was built on the basis that we would always be in the European Union. And now that we have a hard border, now that the transaction time, every passenger has to be checked, has increased dramatically, you simply get very long queues.
Looking into this, I came across this headline. Dover delays, queues ease, but delays could last for weeks. Dover authorities saying French border control booths seriously understaffed, etc., etc. That was from 2016.
Yeah, but-
We hadn't left the
yes.
European Union then.
Sorry, if I could intervene.
Yeah, please.
What we've done is made a bad situation worse, is all that's happened. If you turn around to tell those border staff who you think are understaffed, by the way, you've got to treble the amount of time you spend with each passenger, you're going to get difficulties, and this is what we're seeing.
But there were difficulties before, and why was that?
Well, because of the reasons you cited, that the system itself, bureaucratic and difficult and time-consuming, wasn't being manned properly.
Okay, so
what you've done
one...
is made it more bureaucratic and time-keeping, and therein lies the problem.
OK, so whether we had Brexit or not, the queues would still be there, Simon, do you think?
Oh, no, the queues are much, much worse. The presumption before was that anybody who was in the UK was legally entitled to be in France and the rest of the European Union. Now, the presumption is, well, we're not absolutely sure, and we've got to check everybody and stamp their passports. And that whole transaction takes, as Tom says, typically 3 times longer. And there is also, crucially, no way of just waving everybody through. We have asked in the UK to be treated as third country nationals, the same as people from Turkey. And as a result, the European Union are imposing the rules that it has to impose. So these French border staff, they might not like it, but they've got no choice about the work they are having to do.
Alex, you're nodding in agreement with something Simon said. Come back on that in just a second. But I want to ask you about this. The boss of Heathrow Airport, this came out today, has hit back at criticism from Ryanair, saying it's bizarre to blame airports for not having enough staff, which is where the suggestion has come from. He told the BBC it was up to airlines and not airports to provide ground handling workers. Do you blame airports or do you blame airlines?
Actually, I think the word blame is something that the current CEO of Heathrow Airport specialises in, because if it's not the blaming of Border Force, then this week it's the blaming of the fact that airport needs staff. And apparently that's come as a surprise to the Heathrow board, who have said now, the CEO this morning, that the issue is that the ground handling companies don't have the staff and therefore do not blame Heathrow itself. Whereas, of course, the ground staff making up the fundamentals to be able to run any airport, let alone Heathrow's hub airport. The blame game isn't good for anybody and it doesn't achieve anything. And it's all we see at Heathrow. Passengers are not interested in exactly who missed a forward or a BCC'd email back in February when they were warning that they needed more staff. The reality is that if they were to take some responsibility, recognise that they know the number of passengers they can handle before disruption occurs, to too large of an extent, which they have now recognised with this cap. But newsflash, we're in late July. This is a conversation that should have happened months ago. I just don't think that this blaming anyone is very helpful.
I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying. Well, let's try and get a suggestion of which way the balance and the scales should go here. Is it up to airlines to employ baggage handlers, or is it up to airports?
It's up to both, for sure, because the airports have an obligation to employ, for example, directly employed staff, including those very important ground handling agents, the check-in staff and so on. But in some scenarios, you have them operated by contracted third-party companies. The same applies for baggage handlers. So it really is a mix of both. But predominantly, the airports have that obligation to really take over and handle the bulk of the people that you see on the ground. And if they're not directly employed by the airport itself, then it's the airport employing those contracted companies. And so for me, I think that the fault here on this specific part of the disruption is with the airports. The airlines, of course, were ambitious with that schedule for 22.
Simon, am I being overly critical and overly simplistic when I suggest that they only have one job to do, which is to get you, me, Tom or Alex from A to B? It's not that hard, me and my luggage, me and my body. Why can't they sort this out?
Well, because it isn't very simple. It does require a huge ecosystem of people. There need to be people at check-in. There need to be security officers checking everybody. There needs to be refuelers. There need to be baggage handlers. Of course, you need air traffic controllers. You need pilots. You need cabin crew. And then on arrival, you have to have, of course, the same team members there. And it was in 2019 worldwide working at a fantastic rate of efficiency. But the machine has got gummed up. There's very little any relaxation in the system at all. If there is any overstretch, then immediately things start to unravel. So it is bleak. And I agree that throwing blame around doesn't help. People just want it to work. And I suggest, and this is presumably of concern to Tom, that the more people have miserable experiences, the more people face cancellations of their flights, whether that's 2 weeks ahead or 2 hours ahead, the more people are going to turn around and say, we're not going to bother traveling. It's too stressful. And by the way, it's also an awful lot more expensive than it was before the pandemic.
And Tom is looking a little bit sheepish because the head of the European Tourism Association has told me that he much prefers to holiday in this country because there isn't quite so much hassle.
I didn't say that, but it's true that I take most of my holidays in Wales, but this is simply because, being partly Welsh, I have that prejudice. I think I also travel quite a lot, so it's quite nice not to travel on holiday.
I was being a little facetious.
Well, it's reasonable to interrogate me on that point, but I think what Simon's saying is right. If you look at the Forward Keys data, which maps booking trends using on the airline booking systems, you're seeing a real decline in demand over the last 4 to 5 weeks. There's a steep drop in forward bookings for people going on airlines. So this isn't good news from the tourism point of view. The thing I'd stress is that airports are suffering from exactly the same problem the service economy as a whole is suffering from. Everywhere you go in the service economy, you'll find that hotels can't find staff, attractions can't find staff, restaurants can't find staff. And
across Europe as well, though, isn't it?
It's across the globe. And is this a Brexit conversation? Not directly.
Well, not because if they can't find them in Italy, and if they can't find them in Germany, and if they can't find them in southern Spain, and if they can't find them in Colombia, it's not a Brexit issue.
It's not. Well, it's not a Brexit issue directly. The only problem is that with Brexit, the problem is far more acute in the UK. In the UK, we have hotels cancelling bookings because they can't get the laundry process. They have to close down because they can't get the lift service. It's quite extraordinary how bad the situation is in the UK.
Okay, and if, as Simon says, 2019, everything was going quite well, and we're now in 2022, and things are pretty appalling, how long before we get back to the same level of efficiency as 2019? In other words, when should I book my next foreign holiday? 2 years, 3 years, 1 year?
I would wait and see, is the short answer. I think you will find that the situation throughout the tourism economy will improve. Is the demand and supply, so undoubtedly some wages will go up, people will be drawn into the sector, people will become more efficient. I think you will find that by next year things have more or less settled down, I would have thought. But my correspondents might have a different opinion. Simon, sorry.
No, please.
I was just wanting to know what Simon's opinion.
Absolutely. You carry on, I'll go and get a cup of tea and I'll watch the programme afterwards.
Simon's got a crystal ball here, so he's very good at using it.
OK, quick one from you, Simon. I want to ask Alex about airports, particularly. Sorry. Tom's asked you something, so...
Yeah, OK, getting back to normal. We're not going to get back to anything which is quite normal, but we will probably be back to 100% and perhaps a few digits above that by peak summer 2023. But it will rely on the aviation industry and the rest of the travel ecosystem actually rewarding people much more substantially than they do already in order to attract those people to what's a fantastic profession to be in, but it's just very stressful and requires some extremely unsocial hours.
Better pay needed and perhaps a relaxation of rules for immigrant workers coming to the UK, those two together?
Oh, very much so. I mean, the UK is doing extraordinary things to itself. We had the boss of EasyJet earlier today saying that, 38% of the workers previously in the UK aviation had simply disappeared because of Brexit.
Goodness gracious. Airports worst affected in Europe and one beyond. First 9 days of July, Brussels airport, 72% of its flights delayed. 4 European airports in the top 5 in the world. They are Frankfurt, London Gatwick, Charles de Gaulle, Schiphol. They all make the top 5 for flight delays. The top one is Toronto. And in a single week, up to July the 22nd, 1 in 50 flights across the whole of Europe was cancelled. The thing I notice, Alex, is it's the bigger airports that are worst affected. Smaller airports better, and if that is the case, why are the big ones bad?
Well, if passengers have the luxury to be able to avoid the big airport hubs, then ultimately it means that they get to travel from airports that are not handling anywhere near as much luggage, for example, or the same level of passengers in terms of the surge in demand that we see now, and mix that with transit passengers who are moving across the globe. And that's what those hubs are really there for. Then, of course, this is the time to exercise using those smaller regional airports.
I suppose at the end of the day, if everybody heeds that advice and goes to the smaller airports, they'll be big, bad and busy, and therefore they won't be quite as good as they were before. But Tom, you wanted to come back, I know, and say something about Simon's suggestion that it's the conditions within the industry. And by industry, I mean the holiday industry on the ground, not where you go for your holiday. He says wages need to come up, perhaps migration rules need to change. Is it really that bad that people won't go within a million miles of it?
I think what we're looking at the moment is we're looking at a situation where people, most, I will go so far as to say this, most of the people working in the sector lost their job 2 years ago. And when you've lost your job in an industry, you don't rush back into it. So you've got to recruit a whole load of new people into those roles. And that's the problem we've got at the moment. Will it affect the nature of travel or the demand pattern of travel or what the product is? I don't think so. I think you're going to find that certainly in my sector, which is broadly the inbound sector coming into Europe, people will still want to go to Paris, people will still want to go to London, people will still want to go to Rome, people will still want to go to Civitavecchia. But and similarly, the resort market will continue, the demand will continue for that. The difficulties they're experiencing at the moment are purely to do with the process of getting to your destination, not the holiday.
Simon, I heard you sort of chuckling in the background because, of course, where Tom's just mentioned it is where you are right now. But can I just follow up with something? If people in the airline industry or in the holiday industry are going to say, sorry, enough's enough, you've treated us so badly, you sacked us, no way we're going to come back, why isn't the same necessarily happening across the board in all those industries that were affected? I know they're finding it hard to get staff in pubs sometimes, but pubs and restaurants are still open, et cetera, et cetera. Why is it that the airline industry, or the holiday industry, seems to have treated people so poorly?
Well, if you go back, say 20, 30 years, it was actually a really glamorous industry to work in. But since then, and I welcome the democratization of travel that has come with all the budget airlines, we have seen what's been described as a race to the bottom. This is effectively the airlines desperate to cut fares. They'll do that by making their staff work harder, by effectively demanding more productivity for the same pay. You're working in a very high stress environment. You're doing unsocial hours. A lot of people are going to say, yeah, I can go and work in a bar or a cafe or a restaurant. I'll go and do that, thanks. Nobody's going to be shouting at me at 4 o'clock in the morning, which I can frankly do without. Now, any industry needs new blood. And I see this as perhaps an opportunity to allure an awful lot of new great people into aviation. But they'll only do that if they sense that this is an industry with a future and with decent rewards and decent treatment of people. And just to go back very briefly to Tom's point, I can confirm I spent much of this morning in Rome. Absolutely everybody from across Europe, from across the world is compressed into that great stretch from the Piazza Navona to the Pantheon to the Trevi Fountain. It's absolute madness. Come here in November instead.
Another boring day for you, Simon Calder, at the office, I see. Not that you're making any of us jealous. Tom, I said earlier I was going to ask you, in your capacity as head of the European Tourism Association, about the knock-on effect on European destinations of all of this travel chaos. Because, I mean, it's not just Britain. We've been through that list of airports. Yeah. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere, and it's global as well. I mean, as you've just mentioned, Toronto and Australia have got huge problems. So it's a global problem. I think this problem will be solved. It's the short answer. And I think you will find that the disruptions which have occurred this summer will be forgotten with the prospect of smooth straightforward operations next year.
And
that's what people buy dreams. They don't buy past experiences.
September, schools go back, holiday period's over. That's the time to pick, isn't it? September, October, go somewhere nice then.
Well, September, October happens to be the peak season for American visitors coming over here. So maybe you want to, as Simon says, November, December, if you're looking for a sense of loneliness and quiet. But you could choose other places. There are plenty of places you can choose other than the stretch between the Piazza Navona and the Trevi Fountain.
You're still happy you're still in the holiday business?
I'm always happy that I'm in the holiday business, yes, indeed.
Okay, listen, thank you very much indeed. Good to see you in the flesh. Simon, I'm sure we'll see you somewhere exotic again in the future. Much appreciated. It looks like a mill pond behind you. It looks absolutely fantastic. And let's hope the weather clears up where you are, Alex. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. And thank you wherever you're watching this edition of Roundtable. We really do appreciate your company. Until next time, from me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team.